The era before 1885 is known as the pre-regulatory period. During this time, the government's involvement with surface transportation consisted mainly of subsidies rather than regulation. The first paved roads in the United States consisted of a series of short, private, toll roads. The first major publicly funded road was constructed by the British government in 1758, to facilitate the movement of troops to Fort Duquesne, during the French and Indian War. Some states began building roads in the 1790s. In 1796, Colonel Ebenezer Zane successfully petitioned the federal government for money to build a road from Wheeling, West Virginia, where he owned land, to the Ohio-Kentucky border. This became known as Zane's Trace. It was about 230 miles long when it was completed, representing the first interstate highway. When Ohio was admitted to the Union in 1802, the federal government provided for the sale of public lands, with 5% of the profits dedicated to road construction. This model was adopted in several other states. 4 years later, in 1806, President Thomas Jefferson authorized funding for a road to connect the East Coast to Zane's Trace. When it was completed in 1818, it ran from Cumberland, Maryland to Wheeling, West Virginia. In 1820, Congress authorized an extension to St. Louis, and again in 1825 to Jefferson City, Missouri. This was first known as the Cumberland Road, and later became known as the National Road. However, in a dramatic vote in 1840, Speaker of the House Henry Clay cast the tie-breaking vote against further funding of the National Road, temporarily ending the era of federal support for roads. In 1828, the first common carrier railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, opened for business. This ushered in an era of rapid expansion in the railroad industry. By the 1850s, rail lines blanketed the nation. However, they were often poorly constructed and poorly connected to one another, making interstate travel difficult. Just as today, heavy population density attracted private investments in mass transit and interstate rail on the East Coast. But it was clear that government assistance would be needed to develop an effective rail system throughout the rural West. However, at the time, there were serious concerns about whether Congress had the legal authority to provide funding for railroads, because the United States Constitution does not explicitly give the federal government the power to construct roads or rail lines. As a result, Congress created a complex, indirect funding scheme. In 1850, the federal government donated federal land to the states on the condition that those lands be auctioned, and the proceeds be given to the railroads to subsidize construction. The great era of federal land grants to railroads had begun. In 1862, Congress passed the Pacific Railway Act. The goal of this act was to facilitate the creation of a railway system, from the east to the Pacific Ocean. Not only did it subsidize railroad construction with low-interest loans, but it also gave railroad companies 10 square miles of land for every mile of track they laid. This act was extended in 1863, 1865, and 1866. Between 1862 and 1871, Congress gave away more than 130 million acres of land to the railroads. The result was overexpansion. There were too many rail lines, and many of them were poorly constructed and maintained. Furthermore, competition in the Northeast led to intense price wars. In order to subsidize this loss leader service in the Northeast, railroads charged more in rural areas, where there was less competition. This system ultimately made everyone unhappy. Rural farmers felt discriminated against. The railroads weren't making much money. Even urban riders experienced significant instability in their fares. It became increasingly clear that government regulation was needed. Farmers were particularly angry at the railroads. They were often charged more for short hauls than long hauls, a practice they felt was discriminatory. In the 1870s, farmers organized into a powerful political force, known as the Granger Movement. In response to their demands, several state governments began to regulate railroad rates, as well as the rates of grain silos. The railroads and grain silo owners argued that state governments had exceeded their constitutional authority in passing these laws. The United States Supreme Court initially seemed to reject these arguments. In 1876, in the case of Munn v. Illinois, the court upheld the constitutionality of an Illinois law regulating the operators of grain silos in the state. The court said, when private property is devoted to a public use, it is subject to public regulation. However, 10 years later, in 1886, the court appeared to reverse course when it decided that state laws regulating railroad rates were unconstitutional. The court's decision in Wabash, St. Louis and Pacific Railway Company v. United States, was based on the Interstate Commerce Clause of Article 1. This clause gives the federal government the exclusive power to regulate interstate commerce. The court reasoned that state regulation of railroad rates had a deleterious influence upon the freedom of commerce among the states, and upon the transit of goods through those states. The court noted that because state governments didn't have the constitutional authority to regulate railroads, it should be done by the Congress of the United States. Congress soon accepted the court's invitation, and the era of transportation regulation had begun.